Today, the New York Times was first to report that lawyers for the Trump Organization, the president's business, have been informed by New York State prosecutors that criminal charges are now being considered against Trump's business, and they may come very soon. You will recall that Trump University was pursued as a criminal fraud scheme by New York prosecutors. Trump University was ultimately shut down, and Trump had to pay $25 million to settle that matter. Then it was the Trump Foundation, Trump's fake charity, that was pursued also as a fraud scheme. It, too, was shut down by New York prosecutors, and Trump was forced to pay millions of dollars. Now it's the Trump Organization. It's his core business. And as early as next week, the Trump Organization itself looks like it may be criminally charged, as well as potentially individual employees or executives of the Trump Organization. Now, whether or not the former president ever faces potential criminal charges himself in this matter, and there's no sign of that at this point, what this nevertheless represents is the very real prospect that the former president will be forced out of business with criminal charges that could come as soon as next week. And think about how that arrives right now. Think about the sort of mindset that may be at play here, right? So this word that the Trump Organization's lawyers actually met with prosecutors yesterday. As Trump Organization lawyers are trying to talk them out of filing these criminal charges, prosecutors apparently made it known to them that criminal charges are likely and soon, in a matter of days. And that news arrives within a day of the president's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, having his license to practice law suspended in New York State for what a New York court found were his repeated knowing lies to the public and to the courts about Trump's fantasy that he somehow didn't lose the last election. That news arrived yesterday within a day of Michigan Senate Republicans publicly debunking Trump and Giuliani's claims about the election being stolen in that state as well. Last night, we learned that the effort to, quote, audit the election results in the state of Georgia, that effort is getting turned back by a state court in Georgia. It looks like the Trump supporters' fantasy of doing to the presidential vote in Georgia what they're doing to it in Arizona. It looks like that will not happen, thanks to a judge's ruling yesterday. Today, we learned that the U.S. Justice Department is suing the state of Georgia for voting restrictions that Republicans passed into law in that state on the basis of all the supposed fraud that Trump has been proclaiming happened in that state in that election, which he lost. That Justice Department decision to sue Georgia over that law, it is a huge deal. We're going to have more on that coming up in just a couple of minutes here on the show. But like I said, take these things together, right? Put these things together as bricks in the same wall. Things are not going well in Trump world right now, in a way that is, I think, worse than anything since the first week in January. I mean, from the Trump campaign criminal bribery trial in that New York courtroom this week, which is turning into a little reunion of former Trump officials appearing as witnesses for the prosecution, to the brick walls that Trump is starting to hit with his election fraud fantasy about him somehow being reinstated as president. It'd be one thing if he was like quietly nurturing that hope. He's been crowing about it now for months. As it starts to become impossible and humiliating, his public statements that he will be reinstated are things that he's up against himself in terms of having to reconcile those to his supporters. You ever heard him say like, oh, I was wrong. Turns out that's not going to happen. Really? I mean, and then there's the cold, hard consequences that Trump world is starting to bash into in court, from Rudy losing his law license to these potential criminal charges against the Trump Organization next week, which really could shut down his business. This is all quite bad if you are Donald Trump. Putting his business out of business? I mean, this is existentially challenging stuff to him. And all of this stuff is piling on top of each other in fairly short order. And I put these things together. I can't predict the future, and neither can you. And I know I said this one other time this week, but I just feel like it is worth having a heads up on this. You know, they say when the things get weird, the weird turn pro. When things get quite this bad, things also tend to get weird and radical. I'm not sure anybody can predict what's going to come next out of Trump world, given all of the different pressure they're facing on all these different sides. We do know that former President Trump is planning some kind of political rally in Lorain County, Ohio tomorrow. We do know that another one of these crazy election conspiracy theory movies is going to be released this weekend. The big Cyber Ninjas audit that Trump supporters have been running in Arizona, it was supposed to end yesterday, but it's still happening. They're apparently still just keeping it going, and nobody knows why or exactly what they're still doing. Even as Trump and his supporters proclaim that the result of that will be that the vote is decertified and he's reinstated as president. They said on their own terms that they would be done in April. Then they said they'd be done yesterday. They're not done. They're still doing something, and nobody knows what. None of this is good. But with this much pressure on Trump world right now, I do sort of think that anything's possible. I am hoping for a very boring weekend. I always am. But heads up.